The title of this story alone is enough to grab attention, but what lies beneath is a chilling tale of manipulation, terror, and survival. It begins on an otherwise ordinary summer afternoon in the United States, the kind of day when the world feels perfectly normal, when danger feels like something that only exists in movies or late-night television. But for one family, and especially one young woman, that illusion of safety was shattered in ways no one could ever have imagined. Her name was Jessica Miller, a bright and ambitious 19-year-old college student from Northern California. Jessica had grown up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with tree-lined streets, families who waved at each other on the sidewalk, and the constant hum of sprinklers during the hot summer months. She was home for the summer break, working part-time at a local bookstore and spending the rest of her free time with friends and family. Nothing about her life seemed unusual, until the night that everything changed. Jessica had gone to bed late after scrolling on her phone and texting her best friend Amanda. Her parents, Richard and Susan Miller, had already turned in for the night. Their single-story house was locked up, the dog asleep by the back door, the neighborhood calm. But at around 3 in the morning, Jessica was startled awake by a sound she couldn't quite place. At first, she thought it might have been the dog. But then she heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards outside her bedroom door. Before she could react, the door burst open. 2 men in dark ski masks rushed into her room. One carried a gun, the other held a pair of zip ties. Jessica froze in shock, unable to scream, her body trembling as her mind tried to process what was happening. The man with the gun hissed at her to stay quiet. Within seconds, her wrists and ankles were bound, a strip of duct tape pressed over her mouth. Her entire world collapsed into chaos and fear. The men carried her out of the house without making a sound loud enough to wake her parents. They seemed practiced, methodical, like they had rehearsed this. The family dog barely barked, as if it had been drugged or intimidated into silence. Jessica's heart raced as she was shoved into the back of a van parked a few houses down the street. The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night. Hours passed in darkness as the van drove far from her hometown. Jessica's mind raced with questions. Who were these men? Why had they taken her? Was it for ransom? Was this random, or had someone been watching her? She thought of her parents waking up in the morning, finding her bed empty, realizing she was gone. The thought crushed her. When the van finally stopped, Jessica was dragged out and blindfolded. She felt gravel under her feet, the air dry and cool, the faint smell of pine trees. The men led her into what felt like a cabin or an old shack. She was forced into a small room with no windows, just a thin mattress on the floor. Her blindfold was removed, but the duct tape stayed on. The men said very little. All she heard was one of them muttering, "She'll be worth it. She's perfect." Jessica spent the next several days in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her captors were strange, almost fanatical. They weren't after money in the way most kidnappers were. They talked about destiny, about cleansing, about her being chosen for something bigger than herself. One of the men, who introduced himself only as David, claimed that he and his partner were part of a movement that believed they were saving society by taking people like her, young, educated, from good families. It sounded delusional, but the conviction in his voice made her shiver. Her parents, meanwhile, were plunged into a living hell. The morning after the abduction, Richard and Susan discovered their daughter missing. At first, they thought she might have slipped out to meet a friend, but when they saw the signs of forced entry, the splintered frame of her bedroom window, the scuff marks on the floor, the horrifying truth set in. They immediately called the police. The small suburban community erupted with shock. Jessica was well liked, known by many in town. News crews arrived, posters with her face were plastered everywhere, and her disappearance quickly became a national story. FBI agents got involved, recognizing that the case bore disturbing similarities to a string of unsolved kidnappings across the region. Young women had vanished from their homes under mysterious circumstances. Some were never found. Others turned up weeks later in remote areas, traumatized and unable to explain what had happened. The media began calling it the work of the masked pair, though authorities had little evidence to go on. Inside the cabin, Jessica's days blended into each other. She was given food and water, but her movements were tightly controlled. David, the more talkative of the two men, began speaking to her as if she were a member of their cause. He would sit in the doorway of her room, lecturing her about how society was corrupt and needed to be reset. He said she was lucky, that she'd been chosen to witness what was coming. Jessica knew she had to stay calm. She listened, nodded, pretended to sympathize, all the while waiting for a chance to escape. The other man, who went by Mark, was more volatile. He didn't speak as much, but his presence was intimidating. He often paced the cabin, muttering to himself, always watching her with suspicious eyes. The tension came to a head one night when Jessica overheard them arguing. David wanted to keep her alive, convinced she could be converted to their beliefs. Mark, however, insisted she was a liability. "We can't hold her forever," he growled. "It's her or us." That was the moment Jessica realized her survival depended on playing along, on making David believe she was worth keeping alive. Back home, the FBI was tracing every lead. They discovered security camera footage from a gas station hours away from Jessica's hometown. The blurry video showed a white van matching the description neighbors had given. The agents followed the trail, uncovering evidence that the kidnappers had been planning the abduction for weeks, if not months. They had scoped out the Miller house, learned the family's routines, and chosen the perfect night to strike. Days turned into weeks. Jessica's parents clung to hope, appearing on television, pleading for their daughter's safe return. They offered a reward, begged the kidnappers to show mercy. The entire nation watched as the case unfolded, everyone wondering if Jessica would be found alive. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Jessica began to notice small details that could help her later. She memorized the sound of passing trains in the distance, the pattern of footsteps outside the cabin, even the faint smell of gasoline when the men returned from supply runs. She knew these details could be vital if she ever escaped and had to tell the police where she'd been held. Her opportunity came one stormy night. The rain poured down in sheets, thunder shaking the cabin. Mark had been drinking heavily, his temper flaring. David tried to calm him, but the two men ended up in a violent argument. Mark stormed out into the rain, slamming the door behind him. David, distracted and angry, forgot to lock Jessica's room. Her heart pounded as she realized the chance she'd been waiting for had arrived. Quietly, she pushed the door open, every nerve in her body screaming with fear. She crept through the cabin. At the back door, she hesitated only for a second before slipping out into the rain. The forest was dark and unfamiliar, but she ran anyway, her bare feet sinking into mud, branches whipping against her arms. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Behind her, she heard shouting. They had discovered she was gone. A gunshot rang out, the sound tearing through the storm. Jessica kept running, adrenaline propelling her forward. Hours seemed to pass as she stumbled through the woods. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, but then she saw something that made her cry with relief. A dirt road. She followed it until headlights appeared in the distance. A truck slowed as it approached, the driver staring in shock at the soaked, terrified young woman flagging him down. Jessica collapsed, sobbing, as the driver called 911. Within an hour, police swarmed the area. She was rushed to safety, finally out of the nightmare. Her escape triggered one of the largest manhunts in California history. Law enforcement agencies combed the forests, searching for David and Mark. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Officers with dogs scoured the ground. For days, the fugitives evaded capture, moving through the wilderness like shadows. But eventually, their luck ran out. Mark was cornered in an abandoned barn and arrested after a tense standoff. David managed to flee farther north, but weeks later he was caught in Oregon, hiding under a false identity. The trial that followed captivated the nation. Jessica testified bravely, recounting the harrowing details of her captivity. Her composure in court amazed everyone. Her strength, her clarity, the way she refused to let her kidnappers break her spirit. David and Mark were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jessica, though deeply traumatized, slowly began to heal. Therapy, support from her family, and the outpouring of love from strangers helped her reclaim her life. She eventually went back to college, determined not to let the experience define her. Years later, she even wrote a memoir about her ordeal, inspiring countless others with her resilience. People called it the most insane kidnapping story in history, not just because of the bizarre motives of her captors, but because of the incredible courage and willpower Jessica showed in the face of unspeakable terror. Her story became a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, hope and determination can light the way out. And though she would carry the scars of that night forever, Jessica Miller refused to be a victim. She became a survivor, a symbol of strength in a world that can sometimes feel unimaginably cruel. The kidnappers believed they could break her, but Jessica proved that even in the darkest cabin, in the dead of night, with the sound of footsteps closing in, the human spirit can still find a way to run toward the light. That is why people still call it the most insane kidnapping story in history. Not just because of the cruelty, but because of the resilience, the fight, and the survival of one young woman who refused to be forgotten in the dark.